I'm really excited for today's webinar with Seth Frantzman of the Jerusalem Post. We're going to be talking about the US election next week and what Israel as well as the Middle East can really expect from the outcome of that election. Before we begin, a couple of things I want to highlight and to reinforce here. The conversation Seth and I are going to have and that we want you to be a part of is not a conversation about who is good for Israel or what is good for Israel when it comes to the US administration or any particular American politician. It's for you to understand and to have a much more broader understanding and view of what Israel can expect and the Middle East can expect from these candidates based on their past behavior, based on the policies they've put forth, and based on the campaign promises they've made throughout this election cycle. So this is not about who's good for Israel, who's not. It's really about for you to understand what these people are about, how it might impact their actual policy decisions when it comes to Israel and the region. And you as an individual can subjectively decide, this is good for Israel, this is not good for Israel, this fits my vision for the Middle East, this does not fit my vision for the Middle East, but that's all subjective. The conversation Seth and I are going to have is much more about broadly understanding these candidates and what the countries that will then be on the receiving end of certain policies can then expect from these individuals. Seth, thank you for taking the time to be with us. You're definitely one of my favorite writers, not only the Jerusalem Post, but when it comes to Israel, the Middle East in general. So I'm really happy to have you here with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. To kind of get us started, before we kind of dive into what we can expect from the individual politicians themselves and, the type of White House that they would operate either under another 4 years of a Trump presidency or a brand new 4 years of a Biden administration. Can you talk about how things have changed for Israel and the Middle East dramatically, only in the past 4 years under this presidency, but even in the past decade, whether that pertains to the Arab Spring, the breakdown of a lot of these countries and societies that were set up after World War I by the French and the British, and obviously now what we see more currently, this regional realignment where out of fear of Iranian hegemony, certainly Erdogan's neo-Ottoman tendencies, as well as just the further breakdown of the region, we see a lot of these Gulf Arab countries really first covertly and now overtly showing their friendship for Israel, or at least their interest in having a broader and much more public relationship to hedge their own bets.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's amazing to think we are living now in 2020, which has seemed like kind of an endless year because of the COVID crisis. But what's interesting is it's a kind of year in which a whole series of anniversaries are taking place. And first of all, you have the 20-year anniversary since the Second Intifada broke out, which broke out in September 2000. And it's been about 40 years since the Iran-Iraq war began. It's been about 30 years since the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. And as you just mentioned, 10 years since the Arab Spring. So we have a whole series of kind of waves that have been washing over the region, and each one of which has, I think, massively changed not only the region, but also, of course, Israel's role in the region and also the kind of threats that Israel was facing. So if we were to go back, let's say into 1980, Israel faced a really conventional military threat, which meant that Iraq's Saddam Hussein had a really huge Soviet supplied army. It had Scud missiles. It was trying to construct a nuclear weapon. Israel bombed that site in 1982. So Israel's threats were really conventional, which meant that it was a kind of war in which Israel would face enemies that were in some ways equal. And now we look at Israel today, and it's totally opposite. I mean, Israel is one of the strongest militaries, certainly per capita, in the world. It has the F-35 fighter plane, a fifth generation fighter, which is a plane that was developed in the United States for decades with a lot of partners. Israel has 2 squadrons of those, and it's been practicing a lot with the United States in the region. And all of the countries around Israel are not really military threats exactly like in the past. It doesn't mean they're not a threat. Of course, bus bombings are a threat, and Iran's rocket program and missile program is a huge threat. And if it were to construct nuclear weapons, that would be, of course, an existential threat to Israel. But the kind of threats Israel faces today, I think, are what we call asymmetric, which means, your enemy has one type of weapon. It's not the same as yours, but it can still do your damage. But you need to find a way to confront that threat. For instance, Israel has built this Iron Dome defense system that is able to block rockets and things like that. So I think when we think about the way in which Israel's kind of strategic role in the region has shifted, and as you mentioned, the breakdown of the states in the region that happened with the Arab Spring, which meant that the region went from having a whole series of very powerful countries to, during the Arab Spring, many of those countries, well, I wouldn't say they ceased to exist, but they became very, very weak internally. So that means Yemen, for instance, is in the midst of a civil war. Libya is in the midst of a civil war. Syria is divided, in which part of Syria is occupied by Turkey. Part of it is occupied but the US has influence in eastern Syria, where the US supports a kind of Kurdish-led force. And Iran has a lot of influence in southern Syria, which is a direct threat to Israel because Iran is able to use Syria to traffic weapons and move missiles and move technology to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is located. And that kind of what is called the kind of Iranian road to the sea stretches right next to Israel's Golan border. And actually, I think just a few days ago, there was a reported airstrike against a Hezbollah sort of outpost or something right next to the Golan Heights. And the sense is that, Iran and Hezbollah are trying to entrench very, very close to Israel's border. And Iran has exploited the fact that Syria is a weak state in order to establish itself there, because Syria used to be not a super strong state, but a totalitarian regime that was totally in control of its own territory. But because of the Arab Spring and the rebellion and the civil war, the reality is that when you have a vacuum, someone's going to come into it. In this case, in the region, it tends to be people that hate Israel. When there's a weak area, instead of people coming in that are, interested in peace with Israel, in general, what happens is either people that come in are extremists, and they're either what it could be called Sunni jihadists or Islamist extremists, or they're pro-Iranian, also Islamist extremists, basically. And they exploit the weakness of the state and the vacuum. And then they build up an infrastructure, and that infrastructure tends to be focused on attacking Israel, not always, but usually. And so, for instance, the weakness of Syria and after the Arab Spring means that what you ended up with is this Iranian influence. Now, it doesn't mean, for instance, that the Assad regime is good. A lot of times in the region, there's a false paradigm, which is that, well, Iran is bad, so therefore anything that's not Iran must be good somehow. Or, well, if Iran is, if somehow, you have jihadists in Syria, well, who's fighting the jihadists? Well, the Russians are supporting the Assad regime and they're fighting the jihadists. Therefore, the Russians must be good. No. In the region in the Middle East, generally what you have is many, many things that are bad. And many of those bad things tend to be against Israel. And even if they're not, it's not a question usually of black and white and this is good and this is bad. And usually when we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's why you get to the question of, well, can't Israel do a better job in terms of how it's ruling over the Palestinians, or what about the blockade of Gaza, or this or that? And that's a question is like, yeah, well, okay, yes, of course, for instance, there should not in an ideal world be a blockade of Gaza, or there should not be a military occupation or what have you. But usually the option that Israel faces, or even the region faces, is not a question of whether or not a country like Syria will be Denmark, or whether or not will be the Syrian regime. But usually the question is, will Syria be more like Russia? Will it be more like Iran, or more like Turkey? So usually in the region, because the nature of the countries that are very powerful, because as you mentioned, many countries in the region in the last decade were very much weakened internally. And as I said, when a country is weak, so then something comes into the vacuum. Usually that means I would say Iranian influence, or extremists or terrorists, or in some cases Turkey or Russia, someone is there. And so what you end up with is a very weak or weakened Arab region, which is to say the countries around Israel, primarily Arabic countries, especially Syria, Lebanon, Yemen is farther away, Libya, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have around those Arabic countries, the periphery countries, which are actually the ancient empires of the region, which is the Iran, or what was the Persian Empire in the past, and Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire in the past. So think of the region like, well, if let's be Israel centric for a second, because this is about Israel. I'm not giving a speech about Kuwait. So think of the region like a series of circles, like a donut, and Israel's in the center of that. And somehow the area around Israel, let's say the donut part, is therefore a bunch of Arab states, whether it's Jordan and Egypt, which have peace with Israel, or the Gulf states. They're all basically Arabic speaking. And then you have around the donut, the part outside, would be Iran and Turkey. And then further away, Russia, America, China, the big players, Europe, obviously. So that's the situation we're in. And I think that to get your, we can go back to your question a bit, or you can give a follow-up, but basically I think that's the situation we're in. We've had 10 years in which Israel faced a lot of problems because of the weakness of the states in the region. And again, I want to reiterate, that's not to say that if Israel could rewind the tape and go back to 2009 and have a much more powerful Assad regime and Gaddafi, who was a monster, back in charge in Libya, that would be preferable. It's not preferable. The fact is those dictators like Gaddafi fell. That was a positive thing. The question is, okay, once a dictator falls, what comes next? And that's, for instance, just like in any situation, whether it's the Russian Empire when the Tsar fell, and then you had a period of democracy for like 3 weeks, and then you had a Soviet revolution, what happens is you have to say, okay, what's going to come next? And I think what we've seen happen, what has come next, factually, is that, as I said, Turkey has expanded its power. Turkey, by the way, is run by a government that is very hostile to Israel. Many people are under the false impression that Turkey was a NATO ally and is a friend of the United States and is a secular country, blah, blah, blah. Turkey used to be that, but Turkey in the last 15 or 16 years has become very, very hostile to Israel and has supported more right-wing extremist conservative groups. It's not that different than the Iranian regime. It's different, but I would say it's a question of Turkey and Iran being on two sides of a coin. They're on the same side. And then you have Israel, and you have, of course, Israel's friends and allies in the region, which we of course should go into that discussion in a minute. But just as you noted, Israel has now a bunch of new relationships with Gulf states. And those states are, of course, monarchies. Those are not democracies, but they tend to share a strategic worldview with Israel. And once again, there is a criticism of that relationship that says, well, yeah, but why is Israel not making peace with democracies? Why is it making peace with the Emirates? It's a monarchy. Yeah, okay. The whole region is primarily either monarchies or military dictatorships or Islamic regimes. So the fact is Israel already has relations with all the democracies in the world. It's not lacking in relationships. Israel is only lacking in relationships primarily in the Middle East and a few other Muslim states in the world, like I guess Pakistan, Malaysia, countries like that. So it's not that Israel has a choice of, well, you could make peace with a nice Denmark or Emirates. Well, let's choose the Emirates. No. Israel already has peace with all the good countries and the democratic countries. And it's a question of, okay, in the region, who are Israel's friends? And Israel has friends, and it has countries that are maybe, of course, monarchies, but they tend to be trying to, I think, modernize and preach moderation, and they are not involved, let's say, in exporting extremism or terror finance, which is something that certainly existed in the Gulf decades ago. But I would say that what we look at when we see the Gulf countries and Gulf regimes is that they tend to be trying to be much closer to the West and trying to be slightly more, let's say, open. I would not say liberal democratic, but more open than Iran or, for instance, what's happening in Turkey. And less open, perhaps, than Lebanon or Iraq, which are kind of divided sectarian countries where you have some groups that are actually kind of a bit into Israel, like the Kurds in Iraq, and then groups in Iraq, for instance, that hate Israel because they're very pro-Iran. So it's a kind of a big mess. And of course, that Iraq and Lebanon are a bit more democratic, actually, in a sense. But Israel has no chance to make peace with them because they are primarily held hostage by pro-Iranian militias or groups in the parliaments of both countries. And then maybe if you'd like to do some Q&A, then you can ask me more questions, or I can just keep talking.
Sure. And no, that's Thank you for that introduction. Also, just reminding me for our audience, toward the end of this conversation or as we progress, we really want to know what you're thinking. We want you to be a part of this conversation. So if anything comes to mind, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll take your questions when it's appropriate. Seth, before we get into the candidates themselves and kind of just frame the election and its consequences, can you dive a little more into the Gulf countries? You know, these were countries that were not particularly threatened by the Arab Spring in terms of instability. And yet these are countries that, even with their stability, sought somehow more stability through either Israel or, like you said, through more open relationships with the West. Can you kind of break down, because I know you were alluding to this before, sort of the economic motivations as well as the security motivations? Because it's not as if, you know, it's one or the other, it's definitely both, but can you just kind of discuss, you know, what's in the driver's seat, or how is that directly influencing changes in policy on their part?
Sure. Okay, let's just do a quick primer on the Gulf. So the Gulf states, there's not a lot of Gulf countries, but they're a handful, and they all kind of work together, and they're all part of an ecosystem. Because the Gulf countries, if you went back, let's say 100 years ago or more, they didn't really exist, and they were countries that no one paid much mind to. I mean, insofar as there was importance in the Gulf, it was, of course, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And there were, of course, important people in Mecca and the Sharif, and those people that controlled the pilgrimage routes or what have you. Most of these countries were relatively unpopulated. They were known sometimes by the colonial powers as way stations for, you know, for instance, coaling or things like that. But they were not countries that were real countries. And they were not historically massive regimes, the way the Persian Empire was an empire, or the Ottoman Empire was an empire. So, you know, we have to imagine that these are very small countries that came into being relatively recently. And except with the exception of Saudi Arabia, which is a very interesting, complex story, of course, how it's a country, why is it called Saudi? What's the connection between the Wahhabism and, you know, its origins, et cetera. We don't need to go into it. But let's say, for instance, we look at the ecosystem of the Gulf, which is, I said, an ecosystem, because the ecosystem of Syria and Jordan and Lebanon are a different Levantine ecosystem. The ecosystem of North Africa, which is Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, is an ecosystem unto itself. Each of these things are their own world. And it's, of course, modernization, globalization brings them all together into the Middle East. But the reality is, you know, there are groupings of states that have things, commonalities to each other, and not commonalities so much to things beyond their borders. So when we think of the Gulf ecosystem, let's think, for instance, of the leading power there, which is the Saudi Arabia, which is a powerful country of tens of millions of people. It's an extremely conservative society. It's a monarchy. In the past, it had, of course, had supported Mujahideen and things like that, and worked with the Americans to fight the Russians in places like Afghanistan. And it was, of course, a very conservative Sunni Islamic regime. Then you have other countries, the small countries in the Gulf, which are Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE. Now, those countries, let's say those 4 countries, they're mostly part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're their own little political alliance group, ostensibly. Let's remember, for instance, Kuwait. Why Kuwait was very important, for instance, in the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, causing the United States to send hundreds of thousands of people into the region. And that actually created a whole weird process that helped to radicalize bin Laden a bit and led to bombings and then the war on terror, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Kuwait is a country that was at the time very important. I think today it does not play much of a political, strategic role in the region, but the other countries do. Qatar is a country that is relatively small, but it has a lot of influence in terms of media, because its monarchy invested a lot in Al Jazeera and big media. And Qatar has played an extremely important role in financing and connections, especially to groups in the Middle East that are connected to political Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood. And that would mean, for instance, Qatar was very closely connected to groups in Libya and also, of course, to Hamas in Gaza. Now, some people say, well, that means Qatar supports terrorism. Qatar doesn't see it that way. Qatar says, no, we just support, political Islam, and actually we are able to provide money that can moderate these groups. You can, of course, choose to believe what you'd like, but Qatar has been very close to, let's say, the more political Islamic orientation. It's a close ally of Turkey because Turkey's ruling party is also rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar is also a bit closer to Iran, whereas the other countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain, are not close to Iran. And in fact, they tend to be threatened by Iran. Now, Bahrain, I think, is such a small country. It happens to have a Shiite majority, and it's the fact that it has a Shiite majority or Shiite minority group leads it to be very, very concerned about Iranian meddling because the monarchy is not Shiite. And then let's say the UAE, I think, is the really big, important country in terms of not big in terms of population, but big in terms of economy and big in terms of influence, because the UAE is, as its name suggests, United Arab Emirates. It's a series of emirates. And its leadership has tried to rapidly modernize their countries to become centers of, culture, international trade, everything you hear about Dubai with, internal, what do they call it? They have snow that they make inside buildings and all sorts of crazy things. It's this wild kind of place that's a bit of a combination of Las Vegas and New York and London and Paris and the Middle East all put together somehow. So it tried to become this big cultural hub. But the UAE also is not just a cultural hub. It also tried to be, like Qatar, the kind of Janus face of Qatar and support basically groups that are not involved in political Islam. And it was very, very afraid of Hezbollah and Hamas and groups like that. And it has tried to basically support groups against those groups. And therefore, it ran into troubles with Iran and Turkey. And that makes UAE an ideal partner for Israel because it kind of looks a bit like Israel in a sense. The UAE, like Tel Aviv, is part of the global economy. And it knits very well into what Israel is doing in the region. And, most of these Gulf states anyway, they had kind of relations with Israel since the 90s. They were very open to relations with Israel. They never fought wars with Israel, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, that, of course, as a leader of the Muslim world, was more hostile to Israel in the past. But these Gulf states, the little ones, they don't have any issue with Israel. They don't have a historical problem. I would say that Kuwait is a bit of a complicated story because it's closer to Iran physically, and it used to have 400,000 Palestinians there until the Kuwaitis expelled them because the Palestinians had supported Saddam's invasion, ostensibly. So I think Kuwait got such a bad taste in its mouth from playing politics in the 1980s that it decides to stay out of that and is actually more hostile to Israel. But the last two Gulf states we should mention, of course, are Yemen and Oman. They're very different than the Gulf Emirate type of states, whose cities look a bit like a Las Vegas, Manhattan type of thing. They are not modern. They're not as modern and wealthy. Yemen is, of course, a country involved in a deep civil war. Yemen has lots of extremist groups historically. It has all sorts of problems. It's full of long civil wars since the British left. It has a group of people called Houthis, or a rebel group that is backed by Iran. So Yemen has an Iranian kind of footprint, which threatens Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, since 2015, has been fighting in the Yemen. And I think it's important then to look at the Yemen as an example of why the Gulf states are so interested in relations with Israel, because Iran has trafficked drones and missiles to the Houthi rebels. Houthi rebels are very poor and they live in the mountains. But in the last few years, they've fired missiles hundreds of miles into Saudi Arabia. And you say to yourself, well, how does a rebel group fire a missile hundreds of miles? Missiles tend to needs, of course, some engineering, some footprint, some way to store it and traffic it and build it. Well, obviously, the Houthis didn't build the missiles themselves. The Iranians built them for them. And the Iranians, by the way, have done the same thing with Hamas rockets and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah rockets. Iranian engineers come and they provide you the blueprints and explanations of how you can retool your factory to build the fuselage and the liquid or solid fuel. And then basically you put it together the way you would put together, I don't know, an erector set or a Lego thing or whatever. And you build the rocket. And the Iranians have helped you with the guidance systems and stuff. And so I would say with the Houthis, we're talking about really sophisticated weapon systems and drones and things like that, that actually the Saudis, because they're supplied by the Americans, are supposed to have one of the most powerful armies in the world in terms of what they have access to in types of weaponry. And yet the Saudis have not defeated the Houthis. They fought 5 years against them, and they are fighting a kind of miniature Vietnam in Yemen. And so you say to yourself, okay, that's part of the reason that they want access or friendship with Israel, because they understand not only, Israel has basically defeated Hamas in the last wars Israel fought with Hamas, But Israel and those countries are about all basically are facing a Hezbollah type of situation, whether it's Saudis fighting the Houthis or Israel fighting Hezbollah. We're talking about a 3,000-mile kind of arc of Iranian power that goes from the Mediterranean all the way over to Iran, to Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and all the way around to Yemen. Think of it like a giant snake or something. So that's
the Shiite crescent, as it's often called.
Call it a crescent, whatever you like to call it. I think it's very important to understand that. I think that is, if you sketch that map out, you understand very quickly why these countries are very scared. And look, these countries have a lot more to lose than Iran. Iran is a powerful country in some ways, but it's under sanctions for decades. Iran knows what it means to be under sanctions and under privation and poverty. These Gulf states, these are monarchies, and there's a big money per capita in those countries. They have some of the higher figures of, I think, per capita incomes in the world. So you don't want to have Iranian missiles falling on you when you are living in Manhattan, right? So if you're living in the Manhattan of the Gulf, you don't want, Iranian drones and missiles. But if you're living in the mountains like the Houthis, you can handle some Saudi bombs. But I think that's why, if you were to turn Manhattan into a country the size of Manhattan needs to have allies that are very powerful. And so it makes sense that the Gulf states are interested in being part of the US-Israel security sphere. And I think also because the United States is kind of, let's say, not withdrawing from the region, but the United States, as Trump has indicated, is not interested in foreign wars anymore. And Obama administration also basically said the same thing. We're kind of done with the Middle East. So if you're the Gulf states and you see that the US is moving back, Iran and Turkey is coming in, I think, Israel is, of course, a natural partner. And the question was always a question of when. When will they make peace with Israel? It was never a question of if, because those countries just have a lot of reasons to make peace with Israel. And there was always a question of, okay, what's the final selling point to get them? What is the word in business? Like, get to yes. How do we get you to yes? And that was the question. And I guess we could say that the Trump administration was able to do that. And I think it was successful.
So given sort of the backdrop that you've provided in terms of, how the region has changed in the past decades, it's certainly how that's applied to Israel as well as the Gulf countries. You obviously mentioned the threats of Turkey, Iran, and other issues. Now that we have that, let's introduce the US election into play. Given the immense amount of power and influence that the United States has across the world, including the Middle East, and still even in a sort of post, Pax Americana world in which, the US is not the sole hegemonic power anymore, certainly not the same way it was. Like you had mentioned, both the Obama administration and now the Trump administration have declared their strong intent to obviously pull back and to withdraw from this region, especially in that military capacity. What can Israel, as well as the countries in the region, as you described, what can they expect from another 4 years of Donald Trump? But then also I'd like you to either compare or contrast that to what a 4 fresh years of Biden may look like for them as well.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about Trump first of all. So Trump is a very interesting person. He's a very interesting character. Whether or not, you like Trump or don't like Trump, I think we can separate that from the fact that his foreign policy is certainly interesting. And he has brought to the table a very different type of foreign policy and a certainly different attitude towards it, at least, than most other administrations, probably going back to something like Calvin Coolidge, where Calvin Coolidge had basically said in the 20s, we just don't care about the world. And so Trump has brought into the White House, a mentality that I think is very open about that. He said to the graduating class of West Point early this year, it's not our job, to send you to faraway places that no one has ever heard of. Well, when he says no one has ever heard of, obviously people in Afghanistan have heard of Afghanistan. But America, I think he was channeling the feeling of many Americans that for the last 20 years, America has wasted blood and treasure all over the world. And as he has, I think, said in other speeches, the Middle East is basically blood and sand. We're just done with it. And so he's brought to the table, several different, let's say, processes or policies that are kind of not always sometimes contradictory a bit, but on the one hand, it's a bit of isolationism. So it says, listen, we just don't care. That's one. B, if we're going to care, you need to explain to us why. And I think Trump, if you read accounts of his discussions with his own policy people like Jim Mattis or whatever, when asked about, the US defending Korea, he said, yeah, but why are we doing it? What are we getting out of it? What's the point? I mean, And I think that, he's asked people to justify that. What is justify for me the American presence? Why are we in Afghanistan? We were there for 20 years. What are we doing? We're not going to win, right? Let's leave. And that's usually, I think, the Trump manifesto, which is a bit like, okay, A, let's start with the premise that we don't want to be there. B, if we're going to be there, pay us to be there. And if you're not going to pay us, we're not going to do it. And you could say, well, okay, that leads into C, which is that it's a transactional presidency, a transactional diplomacy. And some people could say, yeah, but that's just because Trump looks at everything like a business deal, because he's basically a New York businessman whose worldview is a bit, to be honest, crafted like lines from The Godfather. The Godfather, by the way, was written, I think, and then produced in times when Trump was in his, 20s and 30s, when he was a younger man. And that's the New York that he grew up in. And I think if you look then at The Godfather and you say, okay, can I find a Trumpian character here, like whether it's, Sonny or Michael Corleone, can I find, someone here that reminds me a bit of Trump? And I think you can find characters like that. And then you say, okay, well, what if you hired a bunch of the people from The Godfather and make foreign policy? How would they do it? And actually in Godfather 2, we actually have a bit of flavor about how that would work, because they all go to Cuba and they are making foreign policy. So I think if we look at the stories there, we get a sense of what Trump's all about. And I'm not saying this is an insult or a caricature. I think it's a very accurate portrayal of what the milieu and ecosystem that Trump came from. We're all children of ourselves in a sense. We can't replace what we are. Harry Truman brought certain things to the table. Churchill brought certain concepts to the table, and so did FDR, and so did Obama. So everyone brings certain ideas, and I think that Trump brought these ideas, and I think these ideas are the ones that have underpinned his foreign policy. Now, the president doesn't make all the policies. Obviously, some wars just run themselves. The war in Afghanistan probably just runs itself, whoever the commander is on the ground, until you tell the commander, okay, we're leaving. And I think that Trump, early on in his presidency, he had made this boast that he said, I've told the generals, just you do what you want. So I think in some senses, America's miniature kind of empire in the world was run by a bunch of proconsuls, which were kind of generals. Whoever was in charge of CENTCOM was sort of running his own war until Trump got tired of it at some point. And then you saw the chaos that was unleashed when Trump said in 2018 and 2019, oh, we're just going to withdraw. Well, the commanders on the ground have been telling our friends, or America's friends, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that's where you run into problems with the Trump administration a bit in terms of foreign policy, and that's what would be the next 4 years, which is Trump has a system which is to do transactional diplomacy, which the premise is that America should not be there. And if America's going to be there, you better sell me why. And that means every country has to justify its existence a bit to Trump. Or at least every military campaign. And now Trump tends to like countries like Israel and Turkey a bit, because Israel says, no, we don't need American troops to defend us. We have the best army in the world. Just give us the F-35s, give us the technology. In fact, we make most of it ourselves nowadays, so we'll actually be giving it to you. And that's a fact. Israel is selling America Iron Dome. Israel provides American tanks with the Trophy defense system. Israel is working on artificial intelligence, laser beams, all sorts of weapon systems that America is now acquiring. So, Israel, if you look at it from a transactional point of view, from the Trump point of view, it's a great deal. It's a good deal. It's an art of the deal, in his point of view. And the Gulf states are the same. The Gulf states will buy American weapons. Great. So from the Trump administration's point of view, it's okay. The Gulf states buy our weapons. Israel makes a bunch of cool technology. That's kind of great. So the Israelis make the technology. America gets it. America sells it to the Gulf. Can't we just put these people together and let's do it all as a great, let's make it work. And I think that's the way Trump looks at it. And that's how Israel got to this a bit, where Israel got. And if we were to see 4 more years of it, I think the question and the concern would be, Trump deal making is a bit erratic. So therefore, Trump sometimes gets angry when he feels he's been misled by his generals or his State Department people. If you recall John Bolton, for instance, Trump was very angry that he felt Bolton was trying to suck him into a war with Iran or other people. And he's criticized Bolton on that fact. And I think that Trump, really is in an odd, weird way. He doesn't come at peacemaking from a peacenik point of view like Woodstock hippies, But he's not into war. He doesn't believe American troops should ever die abroad. And he's made it very clear that if Iran, for instance, threatens the life of Americans, then Iranians will pay dearly. And that's why they killed Qasem Soleimani. It's also why he did airstrikes on Syria. He wanted to show that he would do what Obama didn't do. Because Obama's part of a Trump foreign policy, the last slice of the pizza is that he likes to do the opposite of what everyone else does. And that's a bit like the Seinfeld episode. I think there was an episode where George says, why are they just going to do the opposite of what I would usually do? Trump has a bit of the Dafka opposite aspect, which is to do, if everyone says don't do it, he's like, yeah, but I think I will do it. Because then the people will fear me. And by the way, that's a line, I think, from Godfather 3. I think there's a whole thing in that where they say, Michael, people should fear you. I just think that's what we look at when we see Trump. And I think when we look at the next 4 years, if that were to happen, there's a lot of concerns that Trump will eventually say to Israel or the Gulf states, listen, I got you guys the deal. I'm done. You work it out. And, look, if America walks away, we've seen what happens in the past. When America walked away from Iraq, ISIS comes in. When America walks away from Afghanistan, I guarantee you, of course, the Taliban will take Kabul eventually. I think that we've just seen that again and again. Now, everyone says, okay, so what do you propose? That America will stay forever? Well, no, I'm not sure that's not the opposite. I don't necessarily think that's right. I just think we can guarantee you we know what will happen if America walks away from the region, which is that Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey will all come in. Every bit at which you reduce the American influence, as I said before, there's a vacuum. Someone will come into that. It's not like some magical world where America leaves and it just works by itself. No. Someone will exploit the weakness of America, and they will usually be enemies of Israel, i.e. they don't exploit the weakness of America and then come in and help Israel. They exploit it and they hurt Israel. And I think that's the concern of the next 4 years of Trump administration, is that he will withdraw from Afghanistan, perhaps parts of Iraq, probably Syria, and that will lead to some sort of chaos there. That could also embolden Turkey. Turkey is a regime that is rapidly moving to be in a very hostile way to Israel. According to the Times of London, Israel's Mossad chief has said that Turkey is an extreme emerging threat, and the IDF assessment agrees with that. So I think that's the problem. There is a concern that the Trump administration is very pro-Israel, sometimes being too pro-Israel. If it's under this concept of transactions, might mean that the transaction has to go the other way at some point, and Israel would not be left alone, but Israel would be left with a lot of allies like the Gulf states, in which you say to yourself, well, wait, Israel's the much stronger partner here. Does that mean that Israel has to defend the UAE in the next conflict with Iran? So all of a sudden, what looks like a cool alliance, it puts a lot of burden on Israel, perhaps, especially if America says, hey, we're not doing it, you do it. And, look, there was an attack on Saudi Arabia last year where that happened. Iran used drones and cruise missiles, 25 of them, to attack Saudi Arabia's largest this oil facility, Abqaiq, in September last year. And the Saudis didn't respond, and the Americans didn't respond because Trump's not going to go to war for Saudi Arabia. And that's a big message, because that tells a country, hey, America's not going to do your job for you. You do it. I mean, and the Saudis' response is, okay, but we're not going to go to war for this. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Now, let's look at Biden. Joe Biden is probably one of the more pro-Israel Democrats historically. I think he has a track record that's quite pro-Israel, although, he has, of course, made some critical comments a bit here and there, but he's doctrinaire pro-Israel. He supports, I think, the Israel-U.S. security consensus. Biden is a very traditional Democrat, not the more far left, more critical of Israel one. I think that he comes from a school that is pretty just traditional, even more so than Obama, certainly. So ostensibly what Israel would expect from Biden is kind of more the same in terms of what America policy has been historically for the last 20 or 30 years, which is, pro-Israel in a sense that, Israel, of course, is the U.S. ally, strategic partner. Israel and the United States have a lot of defense industry connections and trade. The U.S. provides Israel with billions of support annually, which is what's called a MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding. that will continue for the next several years. Of course, that would mean Israel will want to negotiate that during the next presidency to see where that stands in the next 10 years. So I think the Biden administration would be for that. I think that the question, of course, would be whether or not Biden would be into the Iran deal and whether he would weaken the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. Now, the maximum pressure campaign in Iran is not primarily a Trump policy. It's primarily a Pompeo policy. Pompeo, I think, who is a very well-learned individual with a very clear worldview, certainly wants to use U.S. foreign policy to do all sorts of things, probably a bit beyond what Trump himself would do if he were running everything. So that's why Trump leans on Pompeo a lot. And Pompeo, by the way, is the last survivor of the first part of the Trump administration. If you look at all the people that were there, like Rex Tillerson and McMaster and Bolton and all these, and many other names, by the way, we cannot even remember now, who have come and gone in an administration, by the way, that has very high turnover, which, if you believe Trump's story about how it's like a business running the country, is bizarre, because you wouldn't want to throw out your CFO all the time. So Pompeo is a real survivor in the administration. He has slowly sponged up a huge amount of power in the administration. If Pompeo stayed with the Trump administration, and he's the architect of the Iran stuff, a lot of it, I think that that's very, very good for Israel in a sense, because he's very, very close to Israel, understands the strategic concepts of Israel being allied with Greece and other types of things that are happening in terms of gas farms and things like that. I think if Biden were to come in, there would be an attempt to be a bit softer on Iran. And the question is whether or not that would embolden Iran's missile program and more of Iran's threats. I do think a difference, though, is maybe in a good thing for Israel, is that the Biden administration appears to be very, very critical of Turkey in a way that the Trump administration has actually basically spent all of its time mostly appeasing Turkey. And Turkey is a very, very problematic regime. I don't mean the country is just a country, but the people that run Turkey, the Erdogan government of the AKP party. In the last few months, they have said, quote, "Jerusalem is ours and we will liberate Al-Aqsa." That's the kind of talk we're used to hearing from Iran. So that means that Turkey and Israel are on a collision course. Trump has tended to appease Turkey, and I think they have been soft on Turkey. And the Trump administration does that because Turkey's president was able to have many phone calls, personal calls with Trump, in which he basically sold Trump on the ideas, yeah, listen, when you leave the region, we, Turkey, will just take it over because we'll do everything for you. And, we give lots of money to NATO. And that's a good thing. Don't you, Trump? You've always said the Europeans don't contribute to NATO, but we, Turkey, do. And Trump has said, well, that's great. And that's where you see a real problem, because Turkey is a very anti-American, anti-Israel actor. And yet the Trump administration has basically been okay with them because they feel that, well, okay, if you're willing to do it, okay. So that's where the Biden administration, I think, would be tougher on Turkey, and that would probably be good for Israel in the long run. But it would be softer on Iran. I do think the Biden administration would probably continue the U.S. presence in Iraq and Syria and maybe even Afghanistan, because Biden has been close to policy circles for a long time. And as far as I know, he's never been, extremely into this idea of American withdrawal. I don't think that that's his worldview. Biden was born in 1942. He grew up during the Cold War. His formative years were periods of American global power. And I think that he believes in American power, and he believes in traditional American concepts like freedom, like the kind of things JFK believed in. And JFK, of course, was a main proponent of making America one of the most powerful countries in the world. So I think that that is a bit of what you get from Biden. It doesn't mean you get the JFK youth and things, but insofar as the Biden apparatus is there, I think if he's not held hostage to some of the radical left in the Democratic Party, which are very anti-Israel, which actually see Israel, some people in the Democratic Party on the far left, as one of the worst countries in the world, oddly enough, because if you look at people like Ben Rhodes, who was very close to Obama, every time he mentions a list of bad countries that he doesn't like that are authoritarian, like Belarus, and he always mentions Israel, as if somehow Israel is one of the problem countries in the world, which I don't think Israel is. I think it's one of the good countries. But I think that Biden may face some pressure, of course, to be tougher on Israel from those radicals. And of course, he has the old foreign policy Democratic establishment that is connected to people like John Kerry, who believed in being quite tough on Israel to get a peace deal with the Palestinians. And the big criticism of the Trump administration is, of course, Trump just doesn't care about the Palestinians. But of course, as I sketched out, from Trump's worldview, but yeah, why would America care? Because Trump's worldview is, wait, we're not in this to be peacemakers, and we're not in this just to give welfare. America's not a global welfare player. His view is, yeah, if you're not going to give something to us, then what's the point? And the Palestinians don't bring anything to America. So, in his view, so I think that's where you would certainly get a difference in the tone of a Biden administration. But the tone is not always substance, in the sense that, he might condemn Israeli settlement building, but doesn't mean necessarily they're going to cut off defense ties. And I think you have to understand that what you get from the tone of the administration isn't always what you get on the ground. The Bush administration, its last years, under Condoleezza Rice, when she was the foreign policy guru, was pretty tough on Israel. And so you say, well, wait, I don't understand. What Obama administration is tough on Israel? Because all the administrations eventually become a bit tough on certain issues because they want Israel to do X or Y. And usually Israel, because it's an independent country, just doesn't do whatever Washington thinks it's supposed to do.
So can you expand on that? Because I appreciate that you started to go into it, but I think the audience would like to hear a little more. Given what you said about, the general U.S. appetite or lack thereof of a sort of foreign adventure, plus, you had mentioned certain elements within the Democratic Party that obviously view Israel in a very critical or hypercritical way, plus the possibility that either Joe Biden does not finish out a first term, or even if after the first term, someone like his VP candidate, Kamala Harris, would become president, potentially. How do you see that shifting the overall potential as far as that direction, U.S. policy toward Israel?
Look, foreign policy is a bit like an oil tanker. You can't really move it much because, foreign policy is about long-term 50 or 100-year commitments, policies like oil deals or defense contracts. These take decades to approve, and then they take decades to get in the pipeline and decades to be delivered. So the thing is, even if Kamala Harris is also not anti-Israel, I think her track record is basically fine in Israel. It's true that there is a radical left in the Democratic Party, which is similar to European radical left, which hates Israel. And as I said, not just dislikes it. It sees Israel as a problem, as one of the worst countries in the world. And that's bizarre because you'd say, yeah, but there's a lot of bad countries. And yet, it's a cause celebrated dislike Israel. So, and look, that's a problem. I do think in general, what we find in the world is even when radical leftists came to power in Europe, where you have countries in Europe where anti-Israel views are very, very much higher than America. You're talking about negative views of Israel are 60 or 70% or whatever. But even when those people come to power, they don't just they don't rain missiles down on Israel. I mean, they're a bit cold. They're a bit hostile. They don't meet with the Israeli ambassador. It obviously means the Israelis don't get invited to the White House dinners if that were to happen. I mean, it means that the Israeli players, like the ambassador, like Ron Dermer or whatever, that they wouldn't be listening to them in terms of foreign policy decisions. I think that's of course what would happen, and that America would certainly shift in terms of its policies because it would probably be also much more hostile to Saudi Arabia and things like that. But the overall trend in the United States is even the people that don't like Israel, a lot of them also believe America needs to have a fundamental radical domestic change as well. They want to have fundamental radical domestic, revolution in a sense in America. If America is spending half its time trying to do a massive domestic overhaul, there will be so much chaos and problems in America. They can't possibly spend all their time bashing Israel. So I just think that, that's the fact. It looks like parts of the Democratic Party in America will become more like parts of the Labour Party in the UK or things like that, in which left-wing parties tend to be pretty hostile to Israel. But hostile, as I said, it doesn't mean that, they throw out the Israeli embassy and close it. I mean, it just means that, yeah, they will be symbolically, lip service-wise, very, very pro-Palestinian. But fine. So, I mean, the EU has been super pro-Palestinian for years under people like Federica Mogherini. I mean, so what? They say lots of things. We support a Palestinian, the right to this, the right to that. Okay, but that's fine. You can say all that all you want. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to go there physically and create a international peacekeeping force, as some people once proposed for the West Bank? Well, no, you're not, because America's out of the game of nation building. America doesn't take over places like Gaza and colonize them anymore. This isn't like America's role in places like Haiti and Somalia in the 1990s. America doesn't do it anymore. So the idea that the United States would be going into places like Gaza and trying to recreate things, even under a far radical left view, they're not going to do that because the radical left in America is also isolationist. They also tend to be so far left that they tend to think that, we could talk to Russia and China, let's talk to them. So it ends up in the same place that you get from the radical right. The radical right in America is totally isolationist and also tends to be anti-Israel. So if you have a few radical leftists, they just end up in the same bizarre place, which is, okay, we don't care about the world. We just want to reform things internally. And, okay. And I just think, fine. So that will make Israel grow closer to countries like India and the Gulf, and grow closer to all the countries Israel is already pivoting to work with Asian countries. It has a lot of close relationships in Asia. The fact is that many Asian countries are, burgeoning, powerful economies of the future, and Israel will just have more relations with South Korea, Vietnam, even. That's where Israel's future is, in a sense, because there is Western decline. So that's the reality. If there's a more hostile American administration, Israel will just have to pivot. And, in the end of the day, as I said, it's like an oil tanker. The captain can be very, very hostile, but the tanker's not going to move very far. It can't. It would take decades to do that.
Sure, with exception to, perhaps like EU building projects in Area C, I understand the point that it's more style rather than substance, that even, through this hostile period of EU's relationship with Israel, the economic trade, both import and export on Israel's behalf, is only going upward. And it's hard to imagine anything otherwise, purely for pragmatic reasons, not even for one being for Zionist reasons or any philo-Semitic reasons for that matter. So, I do understand the point. To kind of close things up, unless anyone has any questions, not to put you on the spot, Seth, but you want to offer a prediction for next week? What's going to happen?
No, I don't do predictions, but we all know how things work, which is that polling is not always what it looks to be, and we learned that in 2016, and that means you won't know until not even election night. We may not know for weeks, because I think the whole early voting and all the weird problems with mail-in ballots and problems, I think there's a lot of question marks. And there could be some bit of chaos, and there's a lot of people obviously with problematic agendas involved. We could have some bizarre surprise the next few days. It's just totally up in the air, and it's not clear. And I guess we'll see what happens. It's a very complicated time in America. Israel is a country that historically has been under threats and wars, but I would say that Israel today looks very, very stable. And American politics tends to look really, really problematic and chaotic. So we'll wait to see, and I hope for the best.